So in our text today, Jesus is talking to the chief priests and the legal experts. And during their conversation, he tells them a parable. He says, a man plants a vineyard and builds a fence around it, then digs a hole for the winepress and builds a tower. Now, this language would have been familiar to Jesus' audience at the time because it's similar to what we have in Isaiah 5. There we hear God talking about the vineyard. God says, now let me tell you what I'm doing to my vineyard. I'm removing the hedge so it will be destroyed. I'm breaking down the wall so it will be trampled upon. Now, Jesus in our text today isn't removing the hedge or breaking down the wall. Instead, the man is planting a vineyard and building a fence. And when he is finished, he leases his land to some tenants, and then the owner goes on a trip. Now, this would have been pretty common in the first century. In fact, it's pretty common throughout history where land is leased to other people. In fact, history tells us that the very first contract that was signed that we can trace back to happened on April 11th in 184 BCE in Egypt. Now, this land that was leased would have also been common in the first century. So peasants around this time, and the time of Jesus, didn't have very much land that they could own themselves. In fact, most of the land was owned by wealthy elites. They had large estates, much like feudal lords or plantation owners. And the peasants would lease the land from them. They would do all of the work. Now, when the harvest came in, the tenants would typically give about 30 to 50% of the yield that they brought either to religious or civic taxes. Now, the rest of it, a piece of it, depending on the crop, went to feed livestock and another piece to seed next year's harvest. What it was actually left was about 20% of the yield, and it is out of this that they would have to pay their absentee landowner. Now, you can imagine then that the tenants who worked the land would create tension with the landowners. They did all of the work, and now they've got to split the 20% that's left with the landowner who did nothing and hasn't been around. So, in our parable, it shouldn't be really surprising then that the tenants don't respond well to the landowner sending servants to collect the harvest. And so the very first servant that shows up that this landowner sends, the tenants beat him, but he's able to walk away. He doesn't take anything with him, but he's able to walk away and go back to the landowner. The next servant that shows up is beaten over the head and is sent back empty-handed as well. The next one that the landowner sends, the next servant, is killed. The landowner keeps sending servants over and over and over again, and some are beaten and some are killed. Well, finally, the landowner thinks, well, I have one beloved son who I love dearly. Surely if I send him, the tenants will respect him. But the tenants see this landowner, or see this son who comes to them, and they think to themselves, well, if we kill this only heir, then we will gain the land that we are doing all the work on. Now, this was totally legally possible in the first century because if the landowner passed away and there was no heir, then those tenants who worked the land, they would be able to claim the land as their own. Now, this story has led me to think about why did the landowner send servant after servant after servant? And I've been pondering this, so why don't you take a minute and talk to your spouse or talk to your family member or reflect quietly on your own. Why do you think the landowner kept sending servants to the tenants? So as I said, I've been wondering this week about why the owner kept sending servant after servant. Why didn't the owner just go himself? I mean, especially after the first servant is beaten, why didn't the owner go? What about after the first servant was killed? Why didn't the owner go then? I mean, after all, this is his land and his harvest, and he doesn't show up. But then I began to think about another more modern parable that many of us know. This is about a man who gets up on top of his roof when there's a flood. And he prays to God and he says, God, come and save me. Well, before too long, someone rows a rowboat near his house. And the man in the rowboat says, come on, jump into my boat. I will save you. And the man on the roof says, no thanks, God will save me. And then a motorboat shows up and offers him a ride, but the man on the roof again declines. Eventually, a helicopter comes by and the pilot shouts down, I'll give you a lift, I'll save you. And the man on the roof says, no thanks, God's gonna save me, I have faith. Well, the water rises still, and the man eventually drowns. When the man gets to heaven, he asks God, why didn't you save me? And God said, I sent a rowboat, a motorboat, and a helicopter. What more did you expect? In much the same way, the landowner sends to the tenants servant after servant, and even his own son. And every single time, the tenants turn away. In our lives, God has sent us many people. God has sent us the prophets we have in the Bible. God has sent us Jesus. God has sent us justice workers like Martin Luther King and Cesar Chavez. And God has sent us Mother Teresa and St. Catherine of Siena. God has sent our children, our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren. God has sent us baristas and checkout clerks. And how many times have we turned away? How many times have we turned away and said, God will save me, I have faith? Take a moment now and quietly reflect on who is speaking or who has spoken the truth of the gospel to you recently. So who has spoken the good news to you recently? So God is constantly waiting for us to respond well to the people that God is sending us. God wants us to respond well. But if we think that we know what God is going to look like or how God is going to show up or even what blessing God is going to give us, it is likely that we're going to miss God altogether. And yet, God, just like the landowner, is going to continue to send servant after servant after servant, hoping that you and I are going to catch the message. Now, in this time when we're not meeting face to face with one another, it is easy for us to lament and to be sad that we are not gathering in the sanctuary this morning. And we might even say, I don't know that I can even worship by myself in my living room. But I promise you, God is going to show up. And when we begin to notice God, I believe we're going to begin to realize that our community isn't so much about gathering on Sunday morning to worship God in the sanctuary, as much as it is about us working together and reaching out to one another in crisis and in hard times. Now, in this time where we have to create some social distance between us, we can be sad, but I think it's rather a really good opportunity. An opportunity for us to train our eyes and our hearts to look for God in our everyday. Look for the ways that God is always present with us in just the everyday tasks that we do. The times and the places that we typically miss because we're too busy running from here or there or trying to get the next thing done. I hope that when we gather together in a few weeks, hopefully, keeping my fingers crossed, that we will realize that what's most important is how we care for one another. And may we also notice that God has been with us the whole time, so that we can then go out into our community and share more fully and more freely the true message of the gospel. And that is, you are loved, and God is always reaching out to us. Amen.